Afternoon guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be talking about drone photography and how you can get the most out of your drone photos, stuff that I wish I knew when I first got my drone. Before we get into this video, don't forget if you enjoy it, please drop a like down below, subscribe if you aren't already to see more of the content and all the other stuff that YouTubers tell you to do. So before we get into tips, something I would like to mention first is that photography is subjective. And what I mean by that is that everyone interprets photography in their own way because it's a piece of art, and it includes how the artist is creating it. So although these are best practices for getting the most out of your photos and getting the best results, you might find for your style that going against all or some of these rules is exactly what you need to get the shots you want. And the second thing to mention is know your drone laws. Know where you are, know the laws of how high you can go, how far away you can go, etc. like that. Know your no-fly zones. Just know all your drone laws before you start flying. So tip number one is don't forget the basics. Now it can be really easy when there's not a camera in your hand, there's a controller with your phone screen attached to it to completely forget everything you know about photography. What I mean by that is the importance of depth, composition and lighting. Jumping straight into the first one, depth. It's really easy to take quite literally flat images when you're doing drone photos, just looking straight down and the image is completely flat. Don't get me wrong, you can get some amazing shots doing that, and I've seen some amazing shots like it. But adding in those extra layers of depth, having some things closer to the camera than other things in the foreground and the background can make a massive difference, especially in drone photography. In terms of composition, it's also really easy to forget the rule of thirds and forget leading lines. Obviously, we all know that you can get great results by completely throwing those rules out of the window, but don't forget them in their entirety, especially when you're starting out with drone photography, because it can still help you get amazing results and it makes your image a lot more balanced. And when it comes to lighting, we all know that light is the most important thing in photography. You physically can't take a photo without light, and the way you use lighting in your photos has a massive impact on how it looks, so don't forget to take that into account when you're doing drone photography. Talking about lighting, that leads us into tip number two, which is sunlight isn't necessarily your enemy with drone photography. And what I mean by that is a lot of photographers will preach that shooting in direct sunlight is horrible, you shouldn't do it, it's the worst thing you can do. And while I agree with that to an extent, I do think there are ways to use direct sunlight to your advantage, but that's a completely different video on its own. In terms of drone photography, if you're shooting landscapes, especially something with water, usually the sea or quite a deep lake, direct sunlight can bring out the most amount of colour out of the sea. So for example, if you're shooting the sea, it can bring out the blues, the greens, the teals, the aquas, really make them pop in your image, in comparison to shooting when the sun's low, which brings out completely different colours and has a completely different effect on the colours in the ocean. Keeping with lighting in tip number three, shadows can make some awesome effects within drone photography. Getting drone shots when the sun is quite low, either in the morning or in the evening, create these really dramatic shadows across your image and can make some really cool effects, so also take that into account. But bear in mind that this enables you to do drone photography at pretty much any time of day. As long as you know how to use the lighting, you can do drone shots whenever you want. Just make sure you're planning what you're doing ahead of time, and make sure you're thinking about the environment when planning out your images, because if you want long leading shadows, you're going to need to wait till the evening or the morning. But if you're shooting water and you really want those colours to pop, do it in the middle of the day. Tip number four is more of a personal preference, but I like to keep my shutter speed at above 1/100th of a second. Reason being for that is with drone photography, your camera is mounted on a flying piece of plastic or metal, whatever it's made out of, which can be affected by a lot of things in the environment, especially the wind. Even with the gimbal attached, it's really easy for your photos to have motion blur and shake in them. So keeping your shutter speed at above 1/100th of a second can limit the amount of shake and motion blur in your images. So that's just a personal preference of mine. Tip number 5, if you've got a drone that can't take portrait photos like mine, I'm shooting with the Mavic Air, A really good way of getting these portrait shots is to stitch landscape shots together. Now this may be a really simple concept, but it's actually something a lot of people don't realise or don't think about, is that if you get multiple landscape shots panning up, you can stitch them all together and get one portrait shot, which can look really good. One thing I'll mention with this is don't do too many, because if you get a massive pan and stitch together into a portrait shot, you're going to get a weird vertical panoramic effect, and it's not going to look good, unless that's what you're going for. If you stick to 3 or 4 images and stitch them together, you can get a normal looking portrait shot out of this. Now don't forget, when you're doing panoramic shots like this and stitch them together, make sure you're overlapping the top and bottom of each image to make sure that the software you're using can properly stitch it together without having gaps. Tip number 6 is that subjects can make your image pop. This is the same as if you've got a camera in hand. Having a subject in your drone photos can make the image pop. It mainly makes them stand out. Look at these 2 shots of me at an abandoned tennis court. You can see here how having me in the shot and having me out of the shot makes a big difference and brings more purpose to the photo in itself. Segueing straight into tip number 7, make your subject pop. And what I mean by that is don't have your subject blending into the image. With me in the abandoned tennis court shot, I'm wearing a white t-shirt, which is making me massively pop out from the background, which is quite dark and gloomy. If I was wearing a black or green t-shirt, I would blend into the floor a lot more and it wouldn't look as good. And tip number 8 is don't always look down. It's a really easy trap to fall into with drone photography, and I did it myself for a long time, is sending your drone really high up and just looking straight down. And don't get me wrong, you can get some amazing shots like this because it's a perspective you can't get any other way. Don't forget, your camera is now up in the sky, so looking up and just straight out like a normal shot is a perspective you can't get any other way. And you can get some amazing shots like this, and it really shows your landscape around you. And tip number 9 is don't be afraid to shoot low. Yes, you're now controlling a flying aircraft and you can go really high, but you can also now get very low and also get into some places that you wouldn't be able to get to yourself. So you can get some really cool shots from lower down, or even the mid-ground of this. Sending your drone up, but not massively high up, just a bit higher than what you can normally get, gives a whole new perspective to what us humans can see holding a camera, and that can look cool in itself. You don't have to send your drone hundreds of feet in the air to get really cool shots with drone photography. So yeah, they're my 9 tips for drone photography. I have only stuck to tips for photography in this video. If you'd like to see some tips about drone videography, drop a comment down below and we can see if we can make that happen. Same goes for editing drone photos. If you're interested in something like that, drop it down below and we can make this into a 3-part set on covering all the stuff to do with using drones and getting shots with them. As to the beginning of the video, if you enjoyed it, please drop a thumbs up down below. It does massively help out. Subscribe if you want to see more of the content, all the other stuff that YouTubers tell you to do. And if not, I will see you in the next video. Peace.